So if you are like me, it's easy to fall into a routine with the editing tools that you use most often. For example, anytime I apply a point curve adjustment to my photo for some refined contrast, I almost always do it the exact same way. It's just second nature for me. And while that's usually fine most of the time, it's good to be reminded that many of Lightroom's tools that we use most often may have multiple ways to apply them. One of the best examples of this is with the pano stitching tool, and the idea for this video presented itself just a few days ago after I returned home from a trip to northern Georgia. On the trip, I was able to photograph some beautiful waterfalls, and in some cases, I took individual photos with the intent to stitch them together into a single panoramic photo. And it was in the process of stitching this particular panoramic photo that I realized I was doing myself a disservice by not paying closer attention to the options that Lightroom provided me. It was a great reminder and a solid lesson that I'm excited to share with you here. So let's dive in. All right, so these are the individual images that I was referring to in terms of stitching a pano together. So I took these in Georgia last week, and I'll walk you through basically the images here, how I took them. So really quickly, this was taken with my Sony a7R Mark V and the 24 to 70 millimeter f2.8 lens, and it was at 24 millimeters. So I had my camera on a tripod, and the tripod that I use, it's a really right stuff tripod, but the thing that I love most about it is I also purchased this additional accessory. It's a leveling base. So no matter what configuration the tripod legs are, I can always use the leveling base to get the camera perfectly level, which makes pano stitching a lot easier. But that's just incidental to this here. I just wanted to tell you a little bit more about the process or the hardware that I used to get the photos. So here you can see, this is the first image in the bracket sequence. And as I go over here, you can just see it allows me to get a wider composition, but also it's somewhat taller because the camera was vertical. Now, when I work with pano images, I don't do too much to them before I stitch them together. I do a few things just because I prefer making these particular changes to the actual raw files and then stitch them together. And then I'll have a DNG file where I'll do the bulk of the editing. So what are the changes that I make? Well, let's open up this first image here. And the first thing that I'll do is I'll go to the editing panel here. And I prefer using the Adobe Landscape Profile. This is totally subjective. You can prefer to use one of the camera specific profiles if you're shooting raw. There might be a creative profile that you like to use, but for me, most of the time, the Adobe Landscape Profile, I don't know, it just kind of, whatever sauce they used, it just suits my taste. So I start with that. Then after that, I'll go down here to the color section. I'm going to click on the white balance dropper here, and I'm going to sample something that should be relatively neutral or gray, which would be this water. And you can see that it does a nice job of getting rid of the color cast there. So we're good to go here. That's the second thing that I do. And then the last thing that I do is I'll go towards the bottom here under the optics, and I'll make sure that lens correction is enabled here. So you can see I can turn it on and off, and it just does a nice job of getting rid of what little barrel distortion the lens had. Now it's worth noting that everything that I'm showing you here, the things that I'm doing to the individual image, as well as the pano stitching, work the same in Lightroom Desktop and Lightroom Classic. So if you're a Classic user, all of the stuff is the same. It just might look a little bit different. So with that, now that I've made these changes, you can see if I hit the backslash key, that was the original image. And then this just looks more clean and neutral. So now I need to apply those changes from this image to the remaining images. To do that, on the bottom here, you can see there's copy edit settings, but there's also a little gear icon. If I click on copy edit settings, it'll just copy everything. I want to choose what to copy. So I'm going to click on the gear icon here. And I'm going to start by selecting none, because all I want to do is select the actual changes that I made. And so if you remember, the first thing I did was I changed the profile. So I used Adobe Landscape. Then under the color section here, I changed the white balance. And then finally, under optics, I'm going to turn on optics here, and I'll disable remove chromatic aberration because all I did was enable lens correction. Let's go ahead and click on copy here. And then I'm going to select the remaining 3 images. And then on the bottom, you can see now it says paste edit settings. So I'm going to click on that. And now all 4 images are synced. And now we can stitch the photo together. So I'm going to go ahead and select all 4 of these images. I'm going to right click, go to photo merge, and then select panorama merge. And here's basically the crux of this video, the lesson that I want to share with you, because when I first went through this process, I did it mindlessly. Just went to stitch the photo and then clicked apply and moved on. And when I looked at the photo more closely later on, almost when I was done with the edit, I was like, wait a second, this doesn't look right. So you can see here how the image is stitched well, but you see this tree trunk and then this other branch over here, how they're kind of bending. I can tell you for a fact that this tree trunk was not bending this way. I mean, the kind of force that would have to be applied to permanently bend this tree trunk would be impressive. It was a perfectly straight tree trunk. And the reason why I didn't even notice it is because I didn't pay any close attention to projection. So projection has been here for as long as I can remember, as long as Lightroom has had pano stitching functionality. There are these three options. There's spherical, cylindrical, and perspective. And I feel like most of the times we don't even pay attention to this. We just kind of stitch it together, we click on merge, and we're off to the races. But I think it's helpful for you to know that there are actual tooltips here. What I mean by that is if you put your cursor over a projection and hover over it, you'll see this little description, and it kind of explains what the most applicable use is for that particular projection. And so spherical it shows it right there. It's just kind of like the best all-around projection. And I think we take that kind of literally very often. Like we're just like, oh, this is the best all-around one, I'm just going to use it. But again, I did myself a disservice, and you'd be doing yourself a disservice by not at least seeing if the other projections can yield a better result. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's go ahead, let's hover over cylindrical, and you can see that it says here, this preserves vertical lines, best for single row panos. So let's go ahead and click on this. You'll see that Lightroom is going to refine the preview here. And while it did a little bit of a better job, you can see vertical lines do look more vertical, I guess. We still have kind of that bend in the tree in the foreground, which I don't like. And that leaves us with the third projection, which is perspective. So if you hover over this, you'll see that it preserves the vertical and horizontal straight lines. And it's best for scenes with buildings and other architectural elements. Now, this is obviously not an architectural element, but it does have some strong kind of straight lines. So let's go ahead and click on this. And so what we see here is the tree is now straight. That is the most important part here. It does come at a certain expense. As you can see here, let's go back to spherical. With spherical, you see how we actually are able to preserve a lot of the original kind of aspect ratio. It's not really impacting the aspect ratio of the photo. You have most of everything here. But with perspective, on one hand, we do get this really nice straight tree trunk. So this is definitely closer to what was actually there, but it comes at the cost where we're losing a lot of this information here. And that's okay for me. And there are a few things we can do. Some of them are recommended. Some of them I wouldn't necessarily recommend in this particular case. To fill this kind of white area here, we can either go ahead with this boundary warp slider, and we can either drag it a little bit. And as you do, you can see that Lightroom is kind of contorting the image. You can adjust this boundary warp basically until you start to see the tree trunk get a bend. So if I bring this all the way to the right, on one hand, it fills the entire image. We don't have any loss of information. But on the other hand, you can see that we have a slight curve. Now, it's not the same as spherical. Watch. Pay attention to the curve in the tree trunk. If I click here, you can see that it is slightly different. So let's go back to perspective here. So again, one of the options is we can go ahead and, kind of slowly increase boundary warp. So maybe right around there looks good. It still looks pretty straight. I'm happy with it. And we've recovered some of that information. Now we still have to do something about the white areas. And so that leaves us with two other options. The first is we can click on this fill edges. And what this will do is it will use some intelligence to kind of content aware fill those edges. And so you can see that Lightroom added stuff that was not there. Like this branch was not there. This information, this area here wasn't there. And again, if we turn it off, you can see what happens. Like, remember, we didn't have that branch there, but Lightroom added it. So that is an option. And then the final option here is to click on auto crop, which will basically crop in until there is none of that white information. Now, I don't usually use auto crop, and I also don't always use fill edges. I'll use fill edges if there's just a little bit of that white space. So if I didn't have this huge chunk of missing information here, then I would consider using fill edges. But when I enable it, I don't know, it's okay. But for me, I'm actually going to disable it. And I'm also not going to use auto crop. So I'm applying a little bit of a boundary warp, and then I'm going to go ahead and click on merge. And so you can see we now have this DNG file. It's our merged pano, and we have that white information. Now, the reason why I didn't click on auto crop is because I'm going to prefer to do the cropping manually. And so I'll go to the crop mode here. I'm going to change the aspect ratio to custom, which will basically allow me to have free control over these bumpers. And so I'm going to move the bumpers until basically kind of what auto crop does, but I prefer having the control myself. So here, this looks good. I'll crop in a little bit there. Actually, let me bring this out. I want more of that. All right, good. So there, that is now our crop. You can see that the tree trunk is pretty straight. We have this really nice high resolution image. If we zoom in, you can see all this really nice sharp detail. Just looks really good. And now what I can do is apply some stylization. So I'll do things like, I'm going to open up the overall exposure a bit. Let's bring down the white point. And let's also open up the black point here. Let's bring down those highlights. Not too much, because it starts to look kind of weird when you try to preserve all those highlights. It was a blazing sunny day, so it's okay to have some of those blown out highlights. And then, of course, I mentioned in the intro, I always apply an S-curve for this kind of more refined contrast. And this image is no different. So I'm just applying a really quick S-curve here. Let's add some of that gray into the shadows to, I don't know, I love that vintagey look for these kinds of landscape photos, but I will reduce the saturation slider here, because when you do apply this point curve, it does add a little bit of saturation. So I'm just going to bring it about there. Now let's keep moving down over here. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to color grading. I want to add a little bit of a blue to the shadows here. So what I'll do is I'm going to take the dot over here in shadows. You might also have this kind of 3-up view, but since I know I'm going to focus on shadows, I'll click over here. Let's go ahead and I'm going to bring this dot out to the blue area. And when I bring it out like this, I'm basically applying a 100% saturation of whatever hue I land on. And so this is kind of how I work with color grading. I find a hue that I like, so somewhere right around there, and then I will press and hold on the shift key, which will lock the dot in this particular hue, and then I can adjust the saturation. So I'll bring it to 0, and then I'll slowly bring it out, and I only want just a little bit of that applied. So I think that looks really nice. Now I can also go to the 3-up view here, which gives me this kind of luminance slider here. And so I'm going to drop the luminance of the shadows just a bit. Next, let's go to color calibration. And under the blue primary, this is one of my most used sliders, the saturation slider. I'm going to increase that. And I mean, it just does a beautiful job of boosting the colors. Further down here, we're going to apply a bit of texture and just a little bit of clarity, not too much there. Now it's time to add sharpening. So let's zoom in on an area that should be sharp, something like this. Let's press and hold on the Option key or Alt key while dragging on the sharpening amount slider. And what I'm looking for is just when things start to get sharp, but not too sharp, like here, everything is getting over sharpened. So I'm going to back off to right around there. And then I want to remove sharpening from areas that don't need it with this masking slider. So press and hold on the Option or Alt key while dragging on masking. And I usually go for this kind of like rough pencil sketch look. That's generally how I explain it, which this is what it looks like. And that removes sharpening from areas that are black. So again, here, anything that's white will have sharpening applied and black will have it removed. And the last thing I want to do is I want to kind of bring out the greens in this area here. I'm going to show you a fun way to do that using the masking tools, which I would say are one of the most powerful tools in Lightroom. Let's click on the masking section here. And then I'm just going to click on linear gradient and I'm just going to drag out. So you can see here, if I enable the overlay, that is the selection there. But again, I really just want to bring out the greens. So how can I do that? Well, I can use a function called intersect, which is basically allowing you to make a selection within a selection. So this is our first selection here. It is the linear gradient. I'm going to go ahead to the mask. I'm going to intersect with, and I'm going to use a color range. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click on one of the colors that I want, like that. Let's turn on the overlay. You can see now how the selection is much more refined. And what I want to do is I want to further refine the color that will be in the selection. I can use this refine slider. If I bring it to the right, it becomes less refined. But if I bring it to the left here, you can see how it's eliminating a lot of those greens. And it's only going to keep a certain type of green. Now I can go ahead and turn the overlay off, and I can increase exposure, for example. I can increase the highlights. I can even go to the point curve here and adjust the midtones here. So I'll make it just a little bit brighter there. And then of course I can add more saturation. And so if we toggle this, you can see it just does this beautiful job of boosting the greens in that area. Let's go ahead and we'll rename this. I always like to rename my mask, so I'm going to call this Green Foliage Booster. And then the last thing I want to do is create a custom vignette. So I'm going to create a new mask and use a radial gradient. And I'm just going to put the vignette kind of over here, over the waterfall. Now, if I decrease the exposure, you'll see that the actual waterfall is getting darker. And that's because the selection is this area. And so what I want to do is I want to flip that. And to do that, all I need to do is click on invert. Now, when I darken that, you'll see that it's darkening the edges, but it's also darkening this green over here, which I just made brighter. So what I can do is I can subtract from this. I'm going to go to the color range, and I'm just going to select this color here. And you can see now that the vignette's not affecting anything with that color, which is great. You can see if I hover over, the selection is actually very precise and very complex. And so watch, if I adjust the exposure, you see how the greens are not being affected. It's just very cool. It's a nice little effect there. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop the amount slider here. This is something that's also very often overlooked. You can control the overall strength of the mask with this amount slider here. So you can make it stronger or lighter. It just gives you a little bit more refined control. So I'm going to bring it right around there. Let's rename this and we'll call this custom vignette. And there we go. So if I go back here and I press on the backslash key, you can see that is the original image that we stacked together as a pano. And then this is what we were able to do with the edits. And again, because we paid closer attention to the projection type, I was able to get a bit more of a realistic shot when the pano was stitched together. Again, in the original projection or the default projection, this tree was kind of bent, which it didn't look right. So I'm glad that I went back and paid closer attention to the options that I have. All right, so I hope that this video inspired you to pay closer attention to the tools that you're using in Lightroom because they can have a big impact on your photo. Also, I showed you some cool tricks on how to use the Lightroom masking panel. And so if that inspired you, definitely check out my new course called Lightroom Masking Essentials. It'll help you master the Lightroom panel, whether you're using Lightroom Desktop, Lightroom Classic, Lightroom Web, or Lightroom Mobile. I'll leave a link to it in the description below. And I've also got these two videos here. I showed you a bit about color grading and the color calibration panel. If you want to learn more about both of those, check them out. All right, if you enjoyed this video, a thumbs up is always helpful, as is clicking on the subscribe button and the bell icon to get notified of all future videos. Thanks a lot, everyone.